and welcome on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I'm Andrew Small, Senior Transatlantic Fellow on GMF's Asia program, normally in DC, but currently in Berlin. This is a collaborative effort between GMF's Asia program and our Mediterranean program. I'd just like to begin by extending our thanks to the Compañía de Sao Paulo, the Policy Center for the New South, and the Luso American Development Foundation for their support to this event. The aim of this webinar is to look at two major strands of Chinese policy, which have sometimes intersected in the so-called Health Silk Road, China's global health initiatives and the fate of the Belt and Road Initiative in the context of the pandemic. And then to dig into the economic, political and strategic ramifications across the Mediterranean region. There are, of course, some other huge issues in play at the moment which intersect with all this on the US-China front, on Hong Kong, on all the major China debates that are underway in so many places at the moment, which I'm sure we may end up getting into. But the topics that we're focusing on from the get-go here are also enormously important, and we have some fantastic experts to address them. Our first speaker, Dr. Jennifer Bouey, the Tang Chair in China Policy Studies at the RAND Corporation, will start us off with the big picture on health. Our second speaker, Dr. Agatha Kratz, Associate Director at Rhodium Group, will continue with the big picture on the BRI before looking in particular at the European dimension of how all of this has played out. And our third speaker, Dr. Jonathan Fulton, Professor at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, will pick up both these strands to examine in particular the MENA dimension of these topics. We also have a really amazing collection of participants for this event as well. So I will be looking out for your questions with great interest as well when we get into the discussion. But let's begin and kick off with Jennifer. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. It's great to be here. This is a bright, sunny day in DC, so I'm talking to you from Washington, DC. So I've been trained as a clinical medicine physician as well as an epidemiologist. So in the last 15 to 20 years, I've been down quite a lot of infectious diseases prevention programs in both US and China. So I get to know the China's public health system quite a while while I was working there. So in the last year, I've been at the RAND, so focused on the research on China's global health, their initial activities in recent years. So certainly the last 6 months, I put quite a lot of time looking at COVID-19. I did several testimony before the Congress about China's COVID-19 management throughout these months, as well as the China's public health and healthcare systems. So I would say that health, lots of attention has come to this health Silk Road. This is certainly highlighted by a phone call between the Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Italian Prime Minister in March. So this is at the peak of the COVID-19 epidemic in Italy. So at the time, President Xi talked about the health Silk Road. It certainly highlights that Italy is one of their major partner in Europe on BRI. And the Health Silk Road means that China will, along their activities with BRI, will provide medical know-how, consultations, and supplies. So that notion certainly stayed in the last few months. So we have seen China has been pushing out a lot of medical supplies and medical teams. Often, these efforts are conducted by the embassies in each country, but it's also some of the aids went through the companies that are working on the major projects in the country, such as Huawei and some of the other biotech companies. We also see that the philanthropists such as Jack Ma and Alibaba Group has donated quite a lot of medical device. So it seems that this is the recent attention has been drawn by this new term, but this is certainly not new for China, because the first time that Health Silk Road was mentioned was actually in 2017, January of 2017. When President Xi went to WHO and signed an MOU with WHO at the time to develop, to improve public health infrastructures along the countries that, having the BRI project. So later that year in August 2017, in Beijing, there was a workshop of over 60 health ministers from the BRI countries, and the WHO Director General was also there. So talk about building public health systems in these countries. But if we put it in the larger picture of global health activities for China, it has a long history. So back in the 1960s, when China was just coming out of the isolation, the first thing they did was to send out the Chinese medical teams to Algeria in 1963, at a time when most of the foreign physicians just left the country. So that started the first medical team, but over all these 60 years, there's always constant medical teams sent to different sort of developing countries, partner countries. So this is one of the 5 forms of global health activities that China has been doing in the last half century. The constructions, infrastructure building is another major activities. The first hospital they helped to build in Mongolia was a TB clinic. And then in, I think it was 69, they built a first hospital in Tanzania. And all the way till a couple of years ago, they built a $30 million, 500-bed hospital in Ethiopia. So as you can see, these activities continues. Around 2010 to 2012, they are focused more on providing medical device and medicine, mostly anti-malarial medicine to Africa. But then that initiative sort of stopped because of the quality, the questions to the quality of this device and medical medicine. They also provide a large medical team 2014 to 16 when the Ebola was raging in West Africa. So at that time, they actually work with the US CDC side by side, building hospitals, building labs. So there has been quite a lot of collaborations between the US CDC and China CDC in the last 20 years. Actually, China CDC was restructured, follow the US CDC structure and its emphasis on epidemiology and the lab. But certainly the relationship has cooled down in the last 3 to 4 years. Most of the activities, programs, offices are closed in Beijing, from the US CDC programs. But here we go with the COVID-19. I think the part of the diplomacy during this time from China is based on, they want to revamp redeem their reputations, international reputations, especially after the early missteps in the management. But they also hope that, at this time when most of the BRI program has kind of paused due to the travel ban, due to the supply chain issues, due to the refinancing issues, they want to bring in some excitement of BRI and health and digital health road. So Silk Road will be the natural guidance. And certainly the last thing I will mention is that China did have probably the first app used in the contact tracing, and many countries have followed that suit. So I think they want to highlight that too. Okay, I'll stop here and I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me just kind of follow up on a couple of points before I go to Agatha, just as partly as a transition actually to some more of these Belt and Road discussions. So the final point that you were talking about there, the tracing apps, for instance. I wondered if you could speak to that, for instance, a little more. We've seen this kind of analysis about Chinese companies offering tracing apps, the other thermal imaging systems, specific cloud surfaces, health codes. I mean, a whole series of these different things. And I'm kind of curious how significantly that's been able to advance in the last period. How important has that digital dimension of the healthcare diplomacy been? What's the level of take-up looked like? And how far has this been able to kind of enact a different kind of phase of the digital Silk Road agenda at a time when, as you say, some of these other things seem to have stalled?
Yeah, so maybe first on the app. So they, I think, started in March. They launched a health code app. This is embedded in the WeChat, which is sort of the universal social media app that almost every Chinese have to have on their phone. Because this app is not only just used for social interactions, but also used to pay your bills, get a taxi, pay your, deliveries. So this is an app, when I'm in China, if I don't have this app, which usually linked to the local bank account, I can't function. So that's the context of the platform of this app. And then in March, they added this health alert function. So apparently it's developed, pioneered in Zhejiang, Hangzhou. That's where it's like Silicon Valley of the US, where most of the innovative technology came out. So they tested this type of app that linking to people's travel history, as well as, they have some input of their, the temperature and how long, their movement in the last week or so. So the idea is put all of that data together and then map to the new cases of COVID, so that if someone has been on the same flight with someone who tests positive, they immediately got alert. So every day, the Chinese citizen using this app could see, well, is my health code, is it green or yellow or red? If it's green, then you can feel free. But if it's yellow, you have to self-quarantine for 7 days. If it's red, then you have to self-quarantine for 14 days. So that's the concept. But I understand that the accuracy of this apparently is very difficult to maintain, but it also differs from province to province, cities to cities. So there are still lots of challenges of using this app very accurately. But the government is really relying on this app in a way to communicate with the citizen about the COVID prevention. So I think that is certainly something that very innovative, and I hope that there will be more reports on how effective this app has been working on in China. Right now, there's not that much outbreak in China, so I think in a way it's a little bit difficult to test how effective that is. But China is also, building the P3 labs and working on there are 5 vaccines are in the human trials. So I think all of these are basically really just concerted efforts to combat COVID-19.
Okay, one more slightly more political question before we go to Agatha. And it's about the response to the kind of mask diplomacy, or a lot of what's been playing out over the last period of time. So there was obviously in the first phase this question of kind of China taking up the mantle of providing global public goods and things like this, which, again, given the origins and things, was always going to be kind of tricky as a sell in one sense. And we've had a lot of polling coming out, particularly in Europe, in the last week or so, in particular, including some things that we've done on this, which has tended to show a much more skeptical view of China as a result of what's played out through the pandemic. Of course, not just for reasons that relate to that, but for a whole series of other dimensions of what's been going on in the last few months. I wondered if you had a sense of, however, of kind of where have these health initiatives and this support that's been provided by China been seen as kind of vital, essential for countries that are struggling to deal with this? And where have you seen this essentially being considered more through the framework of kind of propaganda and kind of upselling of various things that are going on and reputation redemption and things, as you were talking about before?
Right. So certainly the reception of China's these aid has been mixed. Often we have, I think what from the report I've seen, it started with, goodwills and it got pretty good response. But later on, when China is trying to push the partner government to say praise to China, so then they realize, this is not, there's certainly a string attached. So that certainly we have seen there's a pushback on that. So my feeling with these activity is, partly when China was at the peak of the epidemic, it's really focusing all of its attention in trying to, be defensive. Why did the virus came out from China and why there was a delay to admit there was a person-to-person transmission and all of that. But I think in March, when China found that that's when their peak of the COVID first wave has passed, and they found they actually doing kind of better than some other countries. I think that's in a way make the government more confident, and then we see this mass diplomacy started. That in a way to push Chinese model of working with COVID. So I think that certainly reflects some of the calculation there. But I think now they also have received some of the negative feedback. So I think in a way that China is very sensitive to international debate on these. So I think they're quickly trying to adjust. So I think one of the internal criticism that I've seen from China is that, why we're doing all these very superficial, sending the masks, sending a few teams out, but we really should look at a plan how to combat COVID-19 for global. So that's why we see there's a lot more interest in vaccine development and working with international organizations, with CEPI and COVAX, and as well as WHO on thinking about the next step of a vaccine.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll give the floor now to Agatha to take us through the Belt and Road.
Thank you very much. Andrew knows that about me. I like to come into a conference with a few numbers to show. So I've prepared slide, and I'm sorry about that because it might be a little bit less interactive. But I think when one speaks about economics and when one speaks about the Belt and Road, it's important to have a few numbers in mind. So I'll still do it, and I'm going to try and still make it interactive enough. The question that was put to me by Andrew is the question of China's investment and Belt and Road strategy before, during, and post-COVID. What changes? And what changes in particular in terms of China's outward investment, and what changes in terms of China's Belt and Road initiative, and especially as applies to the Med. Now, the problem we've got with that question is that when one speaks about the Med, one actually speaks about two Meds, Mediterranean regions. What I call the EU Med, maybe because I'm a little bit EU-centric here, but or Northern Med, or whatever you'd call it. But I would say EU Med and the non-EU Med to the southern shore of the Mediterranean. There's actually two differentiated Chinese approach to those two regions. The EU Med is much more the target of FDI and investments, with the non-EU Med being much more the target of kind of more typical Belt and Road lending project infrastructure endeavors. And so that means two very different readings, two very different strategies, and two very different impacts pre, during, and post-COVID. So I just wanted to lay it out there. To start with, there are a number of reasons why you've got two meds when it comes to China's strategy. The first one is that, well, in terms of regulation, in terms of legal environment, the EU actually doesn't allow typical Belt and Road project financing and typical Belt and Road project structuring, because you've got public procurement rules in place that will make it illegal to tie a project and its lending together. You have to have open procurement, which is something that you see little of in the rest of the Belt and Road Initiative, especially outside of the EU. The second one is that when it comes to interest, appetite, and kind of commercial interest of Chinese investors, much more of it is concentrated in Europe, and actually, as you see on the slide, much more of it in big European countries. So you see much more investments, acquisitions of assets, acquisitions of companies that will open the European market for Chinese investors in the EU side of the Mediterranean. And you see a lot more lending, a lot more infrastructure projects to be built, a lot more health or social projects fostered and promoted on the southern or kind of non-EU shore of the Mediterranean. And just wanted to put it out there because it shapes what I'm going to say later. There's 4 trends I want to underline about pre-COVID Chinese actions and strategies, and then I want to say 2 things about what COVID means for the EU Med and what COVID means for the non-EU Med. What are the 4 trends? The first thing is that, you know, it might seem pretty obvious to say that over the past 2 decades, China has grown to become a bigger and bigger financial player throughout the world, internationally through lending, through financing, through ODA. But what many will maybe not have seen is how much China has actually retreated financially already for the past 4 years, and especially since 2016. What you see up top on the slide is BOP flows, balance of payment flows, which include both lending and FDI. And what you see is that as years gone by, and especially after 2016, China's outward flows have actually come down dramatically, and that includes both lending and investment. And this is what you see on the bottom side of the slide. On the left side, foreign direct investment have fallen dramatically outside of China over the past 4 years. They are now at about 30% of what they were in 2016. So there was already pre-COVID a retreat of Chinese outward investment for a number of reasons, ranging from much tighter capital controls in China, a deleveraging campaign in China that has kind of cut out the liquidity and financial ability of certain investors to go out and purchase foreign assets. And of course, heightened scrutiny that I'm going to speak about, heightened scrutiny in some recipient countries. But interestingly enough, that's also true of the Belt and Road Initiative. One of the proxies I like to use for Belt and Road projects and for Belt and Road investment and lending is overseas contracts, because usually those are accompanied by debt and they're accompanied by CDB or Exim lending. And when you look at this, there's actually been a pretty big plateauing, if not fall, for 2020, but 2020 is special, as everyone knows, of China's Belt and Road activity after a very big kind of continuous increase up to 2017. There's a number of reasons for that. The first one, of course, is the pushback we've seen from Malaysia, from a number of countries, from Nepal to Sierra Leone, the pushback after the Sri Lanka Hambantota case throughout the world, and much more kind of scrutiny and skepticism around China's Belt and Road activities. But you've got also a kind of a mirroring trend within China of realization that too much had been extended in terms of lending, in terms of project, too fast, maybe not in the most sustainable way, and that a lot more sustainability, a lot more rationality had to be re-injected into Chinese overseas lending. And so when you look at those numbers, when you look at the number of China's lending into Latin America, number of China's lending into Africa and the Pacific Islands, you see the same trend over and over again. And so it's a very important thing to understand that it is not COVID that has kind of broken the trend of China's outward investment and outward lending. That was a little bit happening already over the past 4 years, actually pretty much happening already. The second thing I really want to make clear is that you already had scrutiny of Chinese foreign direct investment before COVID. What you see here on this slide is the number of measures that OECD governments have taken over the years in terms of investment screening and investment scrutiny. And you see that, of course, with Japanese FDI, those increased around the 1970s. They increased with the Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds. between the 90s and the 2000s. But with Chinese FDI, over 2006 to 2019, pre-COVID, you already had a boom of measures being taken in terms of investment screening regimes and investment screening regulations throughout the whole of the OECD. So you already had a pretty high scrutiny of outward investment. We're going to see that this continues with COVID, but it's important to put it out there. Now, the third thing that was already happening before COVID was that debt woes and debt problems were already mounting throughout the Belt and Road Initiative. What you see here on this slide is the amount that China renegotiated with Belt and Road countries over the years in different regions of the world. So, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, MENA, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and the Pacific and Asia. And as you see, starting in 2014 and starting with both, the kicking off of the Belt and Road Initiative, but also with a lot of the loans that had been made between 2008 and 2010, at a period where China was purchasing a lot of energy, mining, resource assets throughout the world. With some of those loans coming due, you had, starting in 2014 and for the past 6 years once again, a very large amount of debt already being renegotiated. So what we're seeing at the moment is, of course, amplified by COVID, but you already had a lot of China's lending running into difficulties and running into problems. So what changes with COVID? You've got a lot of those trends continuing to happen, but a few things do change. For the EU Med, as I call it, and FDI, on the one hand, you've got depressed asset prices that are already happening, already spreading throughout Europe, but are gonna increase in the future. We heard this week, for example, Airbus laying out over 10,000 employees and values of big European companies coming down. And that many would have thought would and will increase buying opportunities for China in the Med region and especially EU countries. But you also have what I described just now, increased barriers to outward investments for Chinese investors that stay in place. The regulatory barriers that I was describing, capital controls stay in place. Financing difficulties for outward investments, which I just described, are actually going to increase because the banking system in China is getting hurt by COVID. And of course, companies in China at the moment are probably much more in crisis management mode, trying to salvage their domestic operations than they are trying to go out and acquire underpriced assets. That's the first thing on the Chinese side of things. On the European side of things, you've got heightened scrutiny, as I said, in Europe and other destinations that has been actually increased with COVID, with a number of high-level declarations that show how much OECD countries are worried and concerned that Chinese investors will come in and buy assets at a cheap price, taking advantage of the COVID situation. As a result, and as of yet, and we're not out of the crisis, of course, we actually see in our data and the numbers that we compile, no surge of Chinese outward foreign direct investment in Europe post-COVID. On the contrary, there's actually much more investment going into China, much more acquisitions of Chinese distressed assets than there is of European distressed assets, interestingly. That doesn't mean that it won't happen in the 2008 crisis and 2012 Euro crisis. These acquisitions actually happened with a lag in time, and they actually happened a few years after. But as of now, we're not seeing what many were frightened about, which is a huge wave of Chinese investment and predatory investment. What about non-EU Med and debt? There are two main or major effects of COVID, especially on Belt and Road, on the Belt and Road Initiative. The first one is in the short term, of course, deteriorated operational conditions. You've got travel bans, you've got trade disruptions, which means that a lot of projects are being put on hold, simple as that. And we've had a few actually statements over the past few weeks saying that as much as 40–50% of Chinese projects, Belt and Road projects, had run into some kind of trouble. And I would expect that a lot of that is due to COVID-related disruptions, especially and delays. In the long term, of course, and more worryingly, you've got deteriorating economic conditions throughout the emerging markets, and that involves, and that includes Med and kind of non-EU Med countries, including rising debt burdens at the expense sometimes of health expenditure, unfortunately. So countries that are fighting and struggling to repay their debt and can't make enough space for actually fighting the pandemic. And so as a result, you've got two main consequences. Once again, on the recipient side, you've got recipients and med countries that are likely to focus much more on crisis management at the moment and trying to secure rescue or rescue lending and financing, or bridge lending and financing as a way to, well, find enough funds to fight COVID at home, rather than new projects. We don't expect, or I wouldn't expect, a lot of big kind of high profile, big ticket projects to be signed in the next few months, even years for that matter. China on its own side is likely to show also a lesser willingness to lend. It could continue to lend. CDB and Exim are state-backed enough, well-capitalized enough, and powerful enough to continue lending. And what they've been lending to the Belt and Road countries is actually very, very, very small compared to the size of bank assets in China anyway. So there's no issue about being able to continue lending. The problem is the willingness to continue lending in a completely deteriorated and very new environment. So probably less willingness to lend, and probably a willingness to lend that will concentrate exactly on what we just heard: health projects, smaller loans, smaller grants, more directed at health, more directed at emergency assistance, so as to, well, first project the image of a beneficial partner, and also because that's low value and very high kind of PR value back. A little bit of technicality here. The Rhodium group has, over the past few years, developed a database of Chinese debt renegotiations to try and understand what are the typical ways that China renegotiates debt with especially emerging markets and developing countries. And in a context where you've got rising debt burden, in a context where you've got Belt and Road lending that has been done on sometimes unsustainable terms, and in a context where, well, the COVID is just hurting the world economy, we're going to see much more of that. There's absolutely no question about the fact that debt renegotiations are going to increase. On top of that, interestingly enough, at the height of the Belt and Road Initiative, about in 2015, 2016, much of the loans and lending that had been extended at that time had about 5 years of grace period, 6 years of grace period, which means that they're going to come due very, very soon. So you've got a double wave of the COVID hitting and a lot of the loans, Belt and Road loans, coming due this year, next year, and in 2022. So we're facing a tsunami of debt coming our way, and China is facing a tsunami of debt renegotiation coming their way. What is likely to happen? You've got an initiative at the moment that's called the Debt Service Suspension Initiative that's being promoted by the G20, but only one of the Med countries we're looking at is actually included in the initiative, and that's Syria. For all other countries, so for the DSSI, there might be a suspension of debt, there might be preferential terms, but for all other countries, what we're looking at and what we're likely to see is a series of bilateral and pretty opaque negotiation. China has in the past, and from what we see in our data, very rarely, if not never, been involved in multilateral renegotiations of debt. Sometimes they've been renegotiating debt in parallel with other debtors and other creditors, but never together. So it's going to be bilateral, it's going to be opaque renegotiations. There won't be any forgiveness apart from zero interest loans, which are a very, very small part of China's lending. So for most part, there won't be forgiveness from what past data tells us. Probably much more a mix of deferrals, pushing back repayment in time, lengthening repayment in time, lengthening grace periods, potentially improving terms of the loan, maybe lowering interest rates, and some possible refinancing. But what I want to say, and this is a nice leeway into Jonathan's presentation, is that politically, so economically, it's likely to be painful. Politically, it's also likely to be painful because everyone likes their banker when they're extending money. No one likes them when they want it back. And that's going to make the situation very, very complicated for China in the emerging world and Belt and Road countries in the years to come. I'll stop here and stop sharing my slide.
Thanks very much, Agatha. Two very quick questions just to follow up. I mean, I think the answer to this is no, but is it yet the case that you're getting something that looks like a rule of thumb for these negotiations that countries are now kind of getting a standardized seeming offer, or are they still very heavily kind of bilateralized and distinctive?
We're not getting any kind of standardized option on the table. We were hoping that at least for the DSSI related countries, there would be some kind of standardization, but even there, we're hearing from a few countries that the terms that the DSSI is supposed to set on the table, which is a suspension of principal and interest for the 77 countries under the program, that even that is something that China is unwilling to abide by because of certain consideration about the fact that CDB or Exim loan might be commercial or non-commercial. In any case, not even a harmonization in DSSI cases. China has not taken place and taken a role in the 9 DSSI negotiations that have happened. It's actually done negotiation outside of the scope on a bilateral level, which shows how much opaqueness we're looking into the future. And then for other countries, what we know of the past is that all of those negotiations have always been ad hoc, depending on the situation of the recipient country, depending on the actors involved. Sometimes there's just CDB, sometimes there's just Exim, sometimes there's an oil company, mining company involved if it's a collateralized loan. So it's extremely complicated to see any kind of harmonization. And we actually don't expect much of that. We've heard of the Maldives that there would be 4 years of debt suspension, but we've heard that of nowhere else. So very hard to say, but I wouldn't expect it to be a one-size-fits-all model. It's rarely been one.
And second very quick question, you talked about the kind of overall volume. There hasn't been a significant influx of acquisitions or investments or anything of that sort. There were a couple of sort of contentious cases kind of in the middle of the pandemic. I mean, the Belgrade-Budapest railway line, there was the kind of almost boardroom coup type thing that went on at Imagination Technologies in the UK. I'm wondering, even if you haven't had the kind of overall volume, have you seen a kind of uptick in these kinds of politically contentious projects? Are these exceptional cases? Are there kind of smaller numbers of very targeted acquisitions while people's attention is elsewhere, as it were? What have you seen in terms of kind of developments of this nature that have been rather more politically sensitive, even if the overall flow numbers are are still substantially diminished?
We've seen very little of it. I mean, back to the slide I presented, the level of China's outward investment in the first 5 months of the year 2020 is at a 10-year low and is 75% below last year's. So you're seeing very, very little outward investment. In terms of politically sensitive ones, we're also very few, interestingly and maybe counterintuitively, the few that you mentioned are the only ones we saw. So it's good, we've got the same sources and we've got the same reading of that. But those are the only one, with one more addition, which is Norwegian airline, which was leasing airplanes and aircraft from a Chinese company. And as a renegotiation of the debt that was getting due and that the company couldn't pay back, acquired some equity into the firm. So you see that case, which is pretty sensitive. It's an airline company, but it's really the fact that we can count it on our fingers of just one hand is probably a sign that Chinese investors are being both very careful and probably very busy doing something else, which is probably managing the crisis at home, trying to get out of the crisis at that point in time. The Belgrade-Budapest railway has just been happening for years and years. And I wouldn't credit to the Chinese the fact that there's secrecy around the contract now. It's mostly on the Hungarian side.
Great, thanks very much. Now, Jonathan, to wrap up the panel section of this.
Okay, am I coming through now? Cool. Great, thanks. So yeah, that was really interesting, Agatha and Jennifer as well. I'm going to come at it from the political side. As Andrew said in the introduction, I'm a political scientist based in Abu Dhabi, and I've been tracking China GCC relations for quite a few years. And the past year or so, I've been looking more at the broader Middle East as I look at how the Belt and Road is reshaping China's presence in the region. And as we all know, for all of us who work on Belt and Road, the problem is everything is BRI. And that means that, it's really hard to decide what actually is. But when you're looking at what's been happening in the Middle East over the past couple of years, and especially after COVID, a pattern's emerging. China doesn't do alliance relations with other countries. It's had a non-alliance policy since 1982, and instead does a strategic partnership diplomacy. And at the highest level, it's a hierarchy of relations. At the highest level, there are 5 Middle East countries: Saudi, Iran, the UAE, Egypt, and Algeria. It's not a coincidence. Those countries all offer something, whether it's geographically, whether it's energy-wise, whether it's geopolitically, or whatever. Those countries are seen as the strategically most important for China in the Middle East. And the next level down, there are several countries that have this other level. Now, if you've spent a lot of time reading the joint communiques that come out of these partnership agreements, it focuses on the typical things you'd expect, stuff like political cooperation and security issues and economic issues, but also there's kind of the softer politics of things like educational exchanges and cultural exchanges and health. And this has become quite interesting, obviously, in the past few months, because when the COVID pandemic broke out, a lot of these countries in the Middle East, especially here in the Gulf that have quite a lot of resources, were, oh, sorry, I thought my video was on. A lot of the countries in the Gulf that are relatively well off were seen as donor countries. They were sending a lot of material aid to China. And then once it started to spread, it went the other direction. So you see the countries at that highest level of partnership, the UAE and Saudi especially, have been very high on the list of countries that have been getting material support from China in treating, tracking, and tracing COVID. The UAE is especially been quite important in this. BGI, this biometrics company based out of Shenzhen, signed a deal with a company in Abu Dhabi called G42 last year. And they've been responsible for a lot of the testing. They've also been working on a vaccine based here in the UAE. They also signed a deal with the Saudis to do testing. I think it was announced something like a $265 million deal last month to do testing in Saudi. They've been doing the same in Egypt and Israel. So you're seeing China's actually been a very active partner for these countries. The countries that are the next level down have also been receiving aid and support, but not to the same level. So when you're looking at what China's doing in the Middle East, I would start by looking at that top tier of countries. It's also interesting because, Andrew, you brought this up in your questions to Jennifer about the negative perceptions. Now, when we hear out of the US especially, but also out of a lot of European capitals, a pretty harsh view of China and its initial response to COVID. We don't hear that so much here in the Middle East. What we hear is a lot of enthusiasm for what China's doing and a lot of appreciation. This is partly because these countries have typically relied quite a bit on cooperation with extra-regional powers for things like security, for things like economic issues. In this case, if they're looking to the EU or to the US for support in treating or handling COVID, they're going to be kind of in trouble. And China's really stepped up in a very big way. So we're seeing some pretty substantial gains just in terms of political coordination, that they're working quite closely. This has been noticed. Secretary of State Pompeo went to Jerusalem in late May and issued kind of a stern warning. You can't continue to work with China on issues that we consider sensitive and still expect to have the same type of security relations with the US. It was kind of seen as an ultimatum, either you're with China or you're with the US. I've been talking with some folks around the Gulf, and there's not really an appetite for that type of a choice. They don't see it in these either or terms. They're quite happy in continuing to work with China in certain issues. And it goes beyond COVID. I mean, a lot of the things that you see in terms of BRI have been also developing quite substantially in recent years. Just down the road from where I live here in Abu Dhabi, there's a port complex called Kizad. It's an industrial park and a port, and China's been putting a lot of money into developing this as a commercial investment. They're using it for energy exports. They're using it for commercial activities. There's a similar one in Duqm in Oman, which hasn't received the same. There's been a lot of pledges for enormous investment. They haven't quite seen it yet. Similar Jazan in Saudi, Port Said in Egypt, this base in Djibouti. And when you see what looks like a set of disconnected commercial investments into industrial parks and ports, it was rolled out, I guess, in 2018. The China Arab States Cooperation Forum has a ministers meeting every 2 years. In July 2018, Foreign Minister Wang Yi announced that there was a cohesion to this. It had the typically awkwardly named, industrial park port interconnectivity two-wing, two-wheel approach. But what it was taking these seemingly disconnected investment projects and linking them up into these business clusters that connect Chinese SOEs around the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa. Where this gets interesting for the Med is because obviously you've got this kind of horseshoe around the Arabian Peninsula that goes from Abu Dhabi in the Gulf region to the Arabian Sea to the Red Sea through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean. So this is actually quite an important issue for the BRI for China. And it also touches upon these strategic partnership countries, the UAE, Saudi, and Egypt being at the top level. So I think what we can expect to see is the support is going to continue. And again, those countries are very receptive, but they also see it as part of an overall structure to a future Chinese presence in the region. Commercially, it makes a lot of sense. If, for example, as I said, the one in Duqm has received pledges for something like $11 billion. That hasn't really started yet, but should it, that's going to be a game changer for Oman. And Oman, of course, is in quite a desperate situation economically right now. I think that's another important point. A lot of these countries have been hammered with energy prices being what they are. And the economic model that you find in a lot of these countries are really reliant on external markets and FDI. And when they look at China, they see a country that has a very clearly articulated vision for how this region fits into its long-term strategic plans. So they're going to continue to cooperate with China on this, I think. And it's not, I don't think, a transactional approach on either side. I think both see it as strategic and long-term. I think we're going to see it become a much deeper, more multifaceted set of relations. Of course, the US could apply pressure if Secretary Pompeo's remarks in Jerusalem extend, and there was a report that the State Department said they're having a similar conversation with all of its allies and partners, not just Israel. Of course, these countries are quite reliant on the US in terms of security issues. So perhaps there could be some kind of that dynamic that fits into it. But I think what's happening in the region is, for now, they're very, very receptive, as I said, to what China has to offer. They're going to continue to cooperate on it and probably wait until November to see what happens. And with the expectation that a different administration in the US might lead to a different approach to China and the Middle East. Because when you look at what China is doing in the region, their interests and the US interests are actually quite complementary. The approaches are different, the way they do it are differently, but actually they're trying to achieve a lot of the same things. So perhaps it's maybe a bit naive or idealistic, but there is room for cooperation rather than competition between these two superpowers in the region. But we'll wait and see how that plays out.
Thanks very much. Just one follow-up on your final point there. Do you think there is? I mean, one of the challenges in the Israeli case has. I mean, I would find when going to Haifa and places like this was there wasn't always a total clarity about kind of, in one sense, what investments are consistent with a certain form of relationship with the United States, which investments are sort of okay on the Chinese side, which are not. There's clearly some that fall into one category and some that don't. I mean, do you see a kind of an awareness or a kind of, and you've seen this adjustment, I think. People would agree taking place in Europe in the last period of time. There's a tier of investments that are just kind of effectively now far more off the table than would have been the case, certainly during the kind of post sovereign debt crisis situation. Do you see a kind of shift in perceptions that is a certain form of security relationship is contingent on certain forms of starting to turn down certain forms of Chinese investments and sort of preemptively moving away from that in the way that you're starting to see that pressure coming in for Israel? Do you think there's that level of clarity or not yet?
I think a lot of it has come as a result of the 5G business that really became more apparent last year. I think when China was talking about building ports or metro lines or highways or hospitals or apartment blocks, I think everybody's fine with that. But once these ports start having, Huawei 5G networks, and these are ports that the U.S. Navy's been docking in, I think then it becomes a security issue, and then it starts to take on a different maybe level of risk for the U.S. in terms of how far it's willing to let those countries go. I know just from talking to folks around the Gulf that it wasn't entirely apparent where that line was, because for quite a while there weren't any U.S. ambassadors in a lot of countries, because obviously after the change in administrations, a lot of Obama appointed ambassadors were recalled, and in some countries there wasn't an ambassador here for a while. So in the UAE, for example, they just received one a few months ago. So the typical channels that would say, hey, don't work with China on this stuff, weren't as obvious, I think, to local interlocutors. So I think we're starting to see that now. The State Department's starting to speak in a much more forceful way. But again, I think that most local actors are looking at it and saying, well, maybe there's going to be another shift in administration in a few months. So let's just kind of cool it and wait and see what happens before we come down either way.
Great, thanks very much. Well, we're now moving into the Q&A section of this. There's a sort of button thing that you can click on and submit the questions, and I will convey them to people. There was already one that came in almost as soon as we kicked off, which I think I will throw Agatha's way if she has perhaps already seen it, which is from Anne Moyson. How has China's aggressive diplomacy since COVID-19 impacted European attitudes towards China, and can this be leveraged along with the US and other key allies to pressure and maybe shift China's behavior?
It's a hard question to answer until the COVID crisis is completely finished, and we don't know when it will be. Certainly, China's aggressive diplomacy has been received very unevenly across Europe. I think some countries were certainly welcoming Chinese aid and Chinese, especially PPE and other equipment shipments as they came in, especially in the early days of the COVID crisis. And especially as it was felt or it was perceived that EU wasn't doing its share, which it turned out it was. But in terms of PR and in terms of the communication around it, there was some level of welcoming at the beginning of it. But the way that China's diplomacy has then turned pretty sour in a number of countries, including France, where I'm sitting here, with very aggressive embassies, very aggressive diplomatic stances being taken, criticizing European handling of the pandemic, of course, has really heated the debate in Europe. Now, I think the debate was pretty heated before. I think we've seen the past 3-4 years of very different kind of shifting of the narrative on China in any case, be it on economic matters with investment screening or reconsideration of export control, but especially the white paper that just came out a week and a half ago. And you had also a lot more in terms of security and diplomacy from events in Hong Kong and Xinjiang to, of course, the 5G debate. So I think a lot was happening before. I think COVID kind of kicked off and amplified some of those positions. And I think certainly on a number of issues, you're going to see the EU willing to push more and be more forceful in an EU way, of course, always polite and always a little bit low-key. But on EU standards, probably more forceful. So the key issue, though, at the end of the day is how do we all come out of COVID, kind of both economically and in terms of our relation to the rest of the world? Because of course, the relationship to China wasn't the best one during COVID, and it still isn't. And certainly events in Hong Kong and Xinjiang this week are not helping in any kind of way. But what if at the end of COVID, you have minus 10-15% growth rate in the US and in Europe, but you've got a very quick and kind of healthy recovery in China? And what if that means that the world has to, once again, same as in 2008, turn to China and hope that China will save the day and rekindle global growth? We have at Rhodium a certain point of view on that, and we believe that the risk and downside risks, especially to China's economic recovery, are enormous. But the risk on US and EU recovery are also very, very, very high. And so the economic cost there and the consideration of stronger diplomatic or kind of harsher diplomatic relationship to Beijing versus benefiting from a recovery where Europe and the US economy are being devastated, to be completely honest, is going to be a big question hanging. Second, of course, in kind of bearing in the balance and weighing the balance is the relationship we'll have coming out of the COVID with the US as well. Chinese diplomacy to the EU wasn't particularly friendly during the crisis, but neither was the US's attitude towards Europe. At the end of the day, there's more inclination, of course, of the EU to lean towards Europe, and I do truly believe that. But the US hasn't made it very easy for us to continue believing that they're a trustful ally, especially in times of COVID. So to be determined, but certainly the COVID crisis has hurt the trust that the EU is putting into China.
Thanks. So there's a couple of questions that I will actually start with this last one and maybe to Jonathan in this. And then I'd also like to come back on a supply chains and nearshoring question and the Med in a bit. So there's a question: in Lebanon, China is promising infrastructure projects funding. Would this mean anything for the Arab-Israeli conflict, especially vis-a-vis energy resources in the Mediterranean Sea?
I don't think so. China's been pretty consistent in most regional crises. They always say this is a diplomatic issue that should be resolved by the states themselves. They say the right things to both sides. That is often mistaken for neutrality. I don't think it is neutral. I think it clearly has preferences. And you can figure out the preference by looking at where the money is going. Obviously, their trade with Israel, is in a lot of high-tech sectors. Their investment into Israel is quite substantial. They cooperate on a lot of really big ticket items. With Palestine, what they do is basically flood the market with cheap consumer goods, which kind of destroy the local economy. And with Lebanon, there's been very little to speak of until now in terms of Chinese investment or very substantial Chinese trade. Lebanon simply isn't a very important Chinese country in the BRI. I think that's consistent. I mean, China's, as I said, it's kind of everything to everyone in the Middle East, but it does have the states that I mentioned are the key actors, and it also has regions that are more important. The Gulf clearly is where China's economic interests lie, and most of its strategic ones. North Africa is not very important to its larger overall vision, and the Levant, I think, is seen as a big high-risk region. So if countries like Lebanon and Syria politically are unstable, and countries like Jordan and Israel are so closely linked to the US, that you don't really see a very deep footprint in any of those places.
And one more in a kind of sort of slightly wider prism on this, does China's BRI footprint, coupled with the US desire to retrench from the Middle East, provide an opportunity for it to act as a modifying great power in the region? Or, I mean, how do you look at the US-China dynamics in all of this beyond the current situation?
Yeah, that is the big one, right? Because I think, again, we kind of look at it as, the US is the established power, China's the rising power, China's going to present an alternative or different approach. And I think what we see in the Middle East is the US has a very militarized approach to the region, and China has a very economics-driven approach to the region. China doesn't have the kind of power projection that allows it to be a very important military power here. I don't think it has any interest in replacing the US as a great power. I think it has a very different vision of what the regional order should look like. But I also think that China's had a very, very good run under this US security architecture, and it doesn't really make sense to disrupt that if they don't have to, if they can continue to develop partnerships with Iran and Saudi and the UAE and Qatar and Israel and Jerusalem, and not have to step up and take on a bigger leadership mantle that the US is expected to, this provides China with a pretty it's a low-cost entry into a region where they have deep interests, and they're not expected to solve any of these problems. As the US seems obviously, and for really forever, wanting to lessen its regional footprint. I was reading a great book about the Gulf that was published in '94 by a guy named Greg Gause, and he talked about how the countries were very worried about Bill Clinton wanting to leave the Gulf. I mean, this isn't a Trump issue, it's not an Obama issue. The US's interests in the region have always been kind of a Cold War artifact. And since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the US, I think, has realized that it has fewer reasons to be here in the same way it has been. And you see everybody saying they want to get out. But while they say this, the arms sales continue, the troops don't leave. I don't think the US is going anywhere, and I don't think China really presents an alternative model or a challenge. I think what they see is just they are the economic development approach to the region, while the US is the more militarized security approach.
Okay, one more kind of specific question, and mull this, Agatha, if you want. From Herman Cohen, to what extent is Chinese infrastructure investment financed by soft loans related to the availability of needed commodities, crude oil, copper, cobalt, etc.?
It is linked. It is really hard to say exactly what proportion is linked to commodities, simply because there's no kind of decent level of transparency on Chinese lending, especially on a loan-by-loan basis. So it's really hard to say. There was an excellent paper, but dating back from 2014, from Gallagher and Rottingham, who said and found that about half of China's lending to Africa and Latin America through CDB and through Exim, especially, was collateralized with different sources and different types of commodities, especially oil, of course, but not only. A lot of coffers, sometimes cocoa beans. It can be really diverse. It depends on the country you're speaking to and about. Today, I've seen some preliminary estimates that would put it somewhere around that same level in terms of the number of loans. But I would also expect in the longer run for that to maybe decrease, because for a long time, countries like Angola and Venezuela and Ecuador, which have and received enormous amount of Chinese lending, were typically oil-backed. But because of the difficulties that China has run into for those loans, especially to Angola, to Ecuador, and once again, of course, to Venezuela, because those took up so much of that proportion, if China lends less to those countries, that ratio might go down. But once again, it's really hard to say, just because we've got very little visibility into loan-by-loan details.
I just want to throw one question to Jennifer before we go to the question that I think you can see from Ian Bond. So to Jennifer, there was the kind of tantalizing suggestion that you made in your presentation about the debate about switching from this kind of sort of flurry of running around doing almost kind of public diplomacy linked health efforts in sort of reputation laundering to something that might be a version of something that would look like a more strategic attempt globally to actually dealing with the continued crisis. I wondered if you might just briefly elaborate on that, and whether how far that discussion has moved, what it might amount to, or is this just a kind of tentative question? Because clearly there still is significant need for this, and the previous iteration of it has in one way, although notwithstanding Jonathan's point about how this has been received in the Middle East and true elsewhere as well, but evidently also been places where this approach has been quite counterproductive to China's interests.
Sure, yeah, so I think that's a good question. I don't think there's a coherent plan yet from China about what is its role in COVID-19. But certainly it's willing to work with WHO. I think with US pulling out of WHO, earlier that China sees itself has a bigger role. When President Xi committed $2 billion to combat COVID-19, I think that's unprecedented. But I think in general, what is the comprehensive plan to strengthen the global health or to prevent a similar pandemic from happening, or how to respond to a pandemic in a similar scale? I don't think we have a comprehensive, we haven't seen anything that's comprehensive yet. However, when we talk about the global health, the motivation for China's global health is really focused on three. One is China understand the pandemic, given that it has several epidemics in the last 20 years, that it understands that the public health issues can have big impact on its economy. So part of their participation in the global health is to prevent issues like COVID, although COVID certainly surprised everyone. And secondly is, part of it, the soft power, to enhance the soft power and China's footprint. And lastly is to protect its economic investment overseas. So given that China, especially with BRI, its footprint has been much widely expanded, is more interested for their companies and their workers or managers to have access to healthcare. So one of the questions is how to integrate China's global health efforts that come along with these companies and projects, how to integrate that with the local healthcare system. Would China be more interested in investing in the local healthcare system as well as other international efforts? And I think someone just mentioned earlier that US-China, often the approach is different, but their goals are similar in regions that we have seen that China's global health focus on more horizontal, focusing on infrastructures, focusing on primary care, whereas US efforts focus a lot more on specific disease. We see that more vertical. Of course, each has crossover to the other because both disease control and the basic health system are important. That's understandable to both, but they are focusing on start at least from different angles. So if there's a way to collaborate and to bring these different parts together, that would probably be best for the global health.
Thank you. So Ian's question, first part to, I suppose to Jonathan, why has the Arab world been so silent on the Uyghur issue? Has China brought silence with investment?
Yeah, so obviously this is a pretty important and interesting question. And there's a lot of factors, I think, that go into explaining it. First, the way China has defined this issue to leaders in the Middle East is that this is a response to political Islamic challenges to the state. They've defined it, the ETM, for example, ETIM rather, as a terrorist group that is inspired by these political Islamists. Most leaders in the Middle East consider political Islam to be a threat to their continued rule. This is something we've seen, especially in Gulf monarchies, that the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, wants to replace monarchy with more Islamic leadership. So when China is able to define it in these terms, it resonates. And you could see, for example, when the Crown Prince of Saudi went to Beijing last February, he was briefed from the Chinese leaders about the issue, and this is what they told him, that this is our response to an ideology that's threatening our state. And his public statement was in support of that, saying, look, you have the right to deal with domestic actors however you see fit. And I think he even said, maybe we have something to learn from this. So on the one hand, this framing of it is a way that leaders in the region are receptive to. Now, on a more popular level, most of the media is state-owned. So you're not going to see a lot of independent reporting talking about the Uyghur issue. When I talk about it with my students, many of them don't know anything about it. They haven't heard of this issue. In fact, they're very surprised to learn that China has a substantial Muslim population. They have a very Han-centric vision of China. So when they see Uyghurs, they're actually quite surprised. I think another issue is maybe, the way Ian framed the question is the Arab world. And Uyghurs are a Turkic people. And I think Arabs kind of look at it as this isn't really our issue, I can't really speak to it because I'm neither Muslim nor Arab, but I think they look at it just from talking to folks around the region, saying, look, do we have to be responsible for everything that happens to Muslims everywhere in the world? Much like would a Christian have to respond to everything that happens to Christians everywhere? Now, I realize that's a little glib, especially given the scope of it and the enormity of it. But I think a lot of folks in the West would see this as something that would fundamentally impact the bilateral relationships between Arab or Muslim countries and China. And I think that just hasn't really resonated the way we'd expect it to. I think that could have something to do with regime type as a political scientist. I think that probably speaks to a lot of it. Yeah, I mean, I think you're better off asking maybe an Arab Muslim person rather than a Canadian white guy.
All right, second one to Agatha. How sustainable is China's external lending if a lot of it is being renegotiated? Is China happy to have heavily indebted clients who feel they have to side with China in international disputes, even if that means it's investing inefficiently from an economic point of view? And I'd kind of just add to that slightly, I mean, how far do the new economic projections change the viability even of a lot of the projects that had previously appeared to be sustainable and sustainable forms of lending and viable projects? I mean, how big a reassessment do you expect on that as well?
A lot. It's a really good question, and it's one that isn't asked, I think, often enough. There's one way to look at it that I like to use usually, which is taking the database we put together of renegotiated loans up to date by Chinese banks and Chinese authorities with the recipient countries. We find at least, and it's a lower bound, at least 50 billion of outward Chinese lending that has to date been renegotiated. That doesn't include COVID. That doesn't include the Belt and Road loans that I was speaking about that are going to come due in the next couple of years. And if you compare, and this is getting a bit technical, but you've got a kind of higher bound and lower bound estimation of how much China has lent over the past 20 years. The higher bound puts that at around 400 billion over 20 years, which we believe at Rhodium to be a little bit overestimated, if not a lot overestimated. And then you've got a lower bound of about 250, 300 billion. We're more towards that, or we believe that it's more towards that side of the equation. But if you take the higher bound, that means that 13% of China's outward lending to date has come under renegotiation, pre-COVID, pre-Belt and Road grace periods coming due. If you take the lower bound, that's actually 1 in 5 US dollar that China has extended outside of the country that has come under renegotiation. For any kind of bank in the whole wide world, even Chinese ones, this is a terrible non-profit loan ratio. This is dire. 1 in $5 that you won't see back or that you have to renegotiate to a certain extent. So pre-COVID, you already have a very, very bad NPL ratio. Now add to that the countries that we know are starting renegotiation with China. Kenya, multi-billion loans to China. Zambia, Angola, the Maldives, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan. And those are only the ones that we're already seeing emerging as coming under renegotiation. Those bundled together, you're adding 20, 25, 30 billion to the number we've just discussed. So in terms of sustainability, it's really bad. Now, you'd have to kind of measure that or control that by the type of country where Belt and Road lending typically flows, because those aren't necessarily the most macroeconomically stable countries. So there's a lot more analysis that needs to go into that in terms of non-performing loan and how much one needs to get back from their investment in those specific countries. But in any case, it's pretty unsustainable. That's the key question. Is China happy about it? I'm not in CDB's boots and I'm not in Exim's shoes, but I certainly personally think not. For a number of reasons. The banks are not happy. CDB is not happy to take a haircut once in a while, and a very big one, on some of the loan it's extended because those were political and the risk management wasn't done enough and properly, or because political will kind of overtook financial sustainability. Recipients are not happy because those loans were signed under sometimes over optimistic assumption, promises promises or estimations made by the Chinese side that those projects were going to make excellent bucks on the investment. The Standard Gauge Railway was supposed to be profitable. It certainly isn't, because 2 years after it's opened, 3 years after it's opened, it's already running into difficulties. We're already seeing debt not being repaid. Same for Djibouti Addis Abeba, which has already gone under renegotiation. So recipients are not happy probably either, finding themselves in that situation. High-level leaders, Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang, who had been very involved in the early stages of the Belt and Road Initiative, traveling around the world to promote it, certainly not happy to lose face either. When Malaysia, and one of their biggest allies in the Southeast Asian region, comes back to them and says, we're not going to take Chinese lending anymore because it's not sustainable, and we actually would rather take that we can repay. Public opinion in China, probably not very happy about it either, that so much of China's financing is going to the outside world when so much is needed for recovery at home. And even just to bring people out of poverty, which is also one of the big objectives of Xi Jinping over the past couple of years. And so, all in all, I don't think China is happy about it. Now, is it not going to take advantage of it happening? I would doubt so. If things go south, and if at the end of the day debts are having to be renegotiated, then there is an opportunity to seize and a political opportunity to seize. So, just making lemonade, I guess, and that's a very, very simplistic thing to say, but you might take advantage of it. And other ways that China could kind of cope with that unsustainability, which were, for example, asset seizing, have turned very, very badly in the Batota case, launching a whole campaign throughout the world of denunciation, debt trap narrative. That means that it's not, or China won't be able to do much of that in the future. So, the potential then for trying to make a little bit of positive out of a number of those that go south is probably trying to make or build political influence from it. But once again, when that happens in the context of renegotiation rather than extending loans, it's also harder to do because once again, it's very, very complicated, painful, and sometimes sours relationship to have to renegotiate a loan with your bank.
Great. A last question from the group. Then I'm just going to give everyone a chance to give some sort of closing thoughts. From Shari Bryan, are there countries in the Med or MENA where China's investments have led to domestic political debate or affected domestic political outcomes? Are there anti-China, anti-BRI civic movements in any of these countries? Maybe Jonathan to start.
Sure. So looking at affecting political debate or political outcomes, not so much. I mean, you can look at, as Andrew can speak to much better than I, you can look at like Gwadar in Pakistan and see that there's a lot of really strong opinions about what China's doing in Pakistan. You don't see that a whole lot. And again, regime type in countries where you don't have open press or democratic norms, you don't see a lot of the same robust debate. Now, in Iran, maybe as an example of an exception to that, a few months ago, I believe it was the minister of health minister made some pretty strong comments about the figures that were coming out of China. And he was very dismissive and I think quite glib about it, said he doesn't believe any of the data coming out of China. And they came down very, very quickly on him and said, you're going to publicly walk that back, because obviously Iran is the very definition of an asymmetrical relationship. They need China's investment, they need China's political support. There's nobody else that can provide Iran with what China does. So they can't really afford to have that kind of open criticism. Now, from what I've heard from Iranian I guess Iranian expat friends, is that the debate within Iran is very spirited, and a lot of people at the public level are very critical of China. But again, the government is so reliant on it that you don't see that. Now here on the other side of the Gulf, you can see some mild criticism, or especially after COVID hit, where people were saying, look, looks like it's going to come out of this faster than anybody else, and we're kind of reeling, and they're getting through quickly. There's a little resentment, but it's always tempered, because again, at that governmental level, there's such a sense that China is going to be the answer to a lot of the post-COVID questions they're going to have. So you don't see a lot of public debate about it, or a spirited public debate. In terms of outcomes, it's not like, you mentioned Malaysia and how we saw how that had a big effect on the election, or the Maldives or Pakistan. Well, we're not seeing that here. You might see it at a different level, where a minister, for example, in Kuwait, there was a lot of talk recently about this new, it's called Madinat al-Harir, this new Silk City that was going to be the capstone project of this new Kuwait 2035 project. And the BRI was going to be a major part of that. And it got a lot of press, and then there was a cabinet shuffle, and then we never really heard about it very much anymore. So maybe at a quieter level, the person who was kind of at the forefront of that within the government got reshuffled, and the government was quietly saying, we don't want to be so leveraged to China, or maybe the US with all the bases it has in Kuwait wasn't as enthusiastic about it. We don't know. There could be some political outcomes that happen kind of behind the scenes that are shifting, but it's not like we see in other countries.
Great. So I'm just going to give each of you a minute or so just to give any kind of closing sort of wrap up thoughts, perhaps starting with Jennifer.
Sure. I think what COVID impact, we'll certainly see that impact for a long time. But in a way, I see that China's response to their management to COVID, as well as its global health activity, are not very different from before. The COVID early misstep is very similar to what happened in 2003 in SARS, when there were provincial government cover-up, there were delays of admitting the severity of the issue, but once it gets the national attention, they immediately implement quarantine and control the epidemic, and afterwards, they restructure their public health system. They has been investing quite a lot to strengthen their healthcare system in the last 5 to 6 years, and lots of investment in the biomedical technology and surveillance system, as well as vaccine development. So I don't think anything is new, even include their sending out medical supplies or helping with other countries. But I think what's different is China's role and the threats that's been perceived by the world now. So in a way that China is a little bit surprised and of these very negative feedback to China. I think to them it's, we didn't do anything different than before, but why we got such a counter. So I think China is learning its lesson, and hopefully the newer generation, I think in Chinese, are a little bit more confrontational. So there are different voices in China. I think the CCP's primary concern is stability within China. So it's trying to balance this, the younger generation willing to use the China's muscle to strengthen its role, and its concern about the negative images. So we see both sides. You know, sometimes they risk these images and to appear strong, and sometimes they back up. And so I think that's what we have seen here. I'll end with that.
Thank you, Agatha.
So much has been said already, so two quick words. Just underlining again how much COVID will be a test case for China's overseas lending, because up to now it had been lending in large amounts, but renegotiation had been kind of little spots, as I showed on my slide, and kind of you know, happening on an ad hoc basis. But now everything is going to come up at one time, and we're going to see how much that shapes the willingness of both the Chinese state and Chinese financial institution to continue lending, or on the contrary, lend less, lend better, more sustainably, hopefully so, in the future. And so it will be very, very interesting to see how the Belt and Road, and especially Chinese overseas lending, comes out of the crisis.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Well, just a couple of things. First, again, thanks. This has been really impressive for me. I've learned a lot from both Jennifer and Agatha. I really, I'm going to bug you for your slides, I think, Agatha. And Andrew, it's nice to meet you finally in person, I guess, in person. I've admired your work for a long time. In terms of China and the Middle East, I think a lot of folks have been kind of dismissing as getting overhyped, and other people say it's under-recognized. From my perspective, it's really just getting misunderstood, you know. And again, a lot of it is this lens of what does the U.S. do? China must be doing the opposite, or trying to do the same thing. And I think it's a really complicated set of relationships. China's working with a lot of different countries in the region, Arab, non-Arab, rich, poor. And I think it really requires a pretty careful look, and maybe just avoid a lot of the hyperbole that we've seen a lot of. I guess that's all I'd say. It's just, you know, it should be looked at carefully.
Thanks, Jonathan, and for the kind words, and really huge thanks to all three speakers. This is a really complex subject, lots of different pieces, all of which are interconnected at the moment, and we're in straitened conditions in terms of being able to get access to information and data and material. So really appreciate the three of you taking the time to kind of piece all this together for people. Thanks to the participants as well for, in many cases, hanging around on a Friday night or a holiday in the US, or even later in certain other locations where people are coming in from. And thanks to my colleagues on the MED program at GMF. Really appreciate the discussion, and look forward to more of these, both with the MED program and the Asia program in future. So have a good night, and thanks everyone.
Thank you very much.